3. Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Monday. Thank you for joining us today, December 14th, 2020, for our Superintendent's Budget Advisory Task Force. One more week until we hit winter break, and I'm not sure if anybody's counting, but I know we are all counting. So as we get started, as we have done in our previous meetings, we will start with reviewing our norms and our goals. I'm going to share my screen real briefly. All right, can you guys see that okay? Okay, thank you. So I just added it on the agenda for our norms. I'll give you a chance to review that. And our task force goals are also there for us to review. And I apologize, I didn't adjust the agenda. We're not going to spend 20 minutes on our purpose and goals. That should have been adjusted from a prior meeting. We're only going to spend another minute or two. Any questions from the group on meeting norms or task force goals before we enter into our meeting? Not seeing any. Okay, then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we will go into the bulk of our meeting. And that is an overview or summary of our town hall events, as well as just a brief high-level overview of our meetings with our employee groups. And then we'll begin talking about input from this task force regarding our next steps with the budget. So I would certainly welcome other input from members of the task force, because I know some of you were at many of these town halls. But to kind of give an overarching view of what's been happening, as you may know, myself and my executive cabinet met with each of our employee groups. That includes FUTA, CSEA, SEIU, and FSMA. We met with all of them separately to review some budget questions, some budget solutions, some collaboration. And each one of those meetings was a little bit different. I think it was a good thing to be able to have a platform for those discussions. And we did hear some good things come out of that. We also got some great questions for us to consider as we move forward with our budget work. Since then, as you know, we've also held 5 different community budget town hall events. And I think those were very successful in the sense of the people who attended provided good feedback. We heard from a lot of voices that this really helped people understand how schools are funded, some of the challenges that schools face as we look at budgeting, some more information for our community about how schools are funded through the state and federal government. And we certainly heard feedback from our community at all 5 of the town hall events. Some key points that I gathered in my note taking from these meetings were that we should certainly spend time as a district reviewing our budgeting. And by that, I mean on a year-to-year basis, if we allocate a specific amount of money for a specific expenditure, how do we critically analyze if year to year we should continue allocating the same amount, more or less? And I think we all recognize that's just a good practice for us to be doing on a regular basis. That we continue to collaborate with our employee groups as we get through the process of budget balancing and revenue and enhancements. One of the key themes that we heard throughout our community meetings was the focus on increased services for mental health. We also heard clear considerations for how do we support our special education programs and students and manage our resources most effectively. And I'm summarizing some of these things, so please forgive me if it's not a verbatim of all of the remarks. And we also heard some great discussion in terms of local actions that we can take for advocating for more funding and or creating more revenue streams for the district. We heard a lot of people talk about and ask about a parcel tax, and talk about and ask about how we can advocate at the state and federal level for increased funding. So at this point, I want to stop for a moment and see if anybody else has something to share in that regard. And if I could ask Ms. Sandoval for the moment, if you can just keep an eye on the meeting. I'm going to go stop this sun from coming through the window so dramatically in my eye during this. I'll be right back.
Sure.
But I am listening.
I had a question regarding the revenue enhancement, and this could be maybe a question for the trustees who have looked into this a lot more politically. But considering the state just failed Prop 15, Fremont just failed a parcel tax. I'm reading more about it and, looking into the kind of ways that we budget, not just FUSD, but California. In California, there's different ways to rate and grade. And California gets like an A rating for distribution equitably, meaning LCFF has been documented to really give cities and communities the need based on the student need. But for funding level, we're getting an F, right? So aside from just like propositions and parcel tax, which of course will continue to work with the community, and maybe if mental health is something that we're really seeing we have increased need on, obviously we would work with the community for what resonates if we look at a future parcel tax, because if that's the community and student need, we want to be responsive to that. But what other ways, can senators, can assemblymen, or assembly persons, who can put together a package or get something passed at the state level for us that increases school funding that isn't the ways that we've already very recently tried, right? Like, is there a way to keep applying pressure over the next year or two while we continue to mobilize and look at other things that may work or other pressure points?
If you don't mind, CJ, I'll answer with what I know. At the time that Schools and Communities First was pushed, there were actually kind of two approaches being taken. One was Schools and Communities First, and one was full and fair funding. And the full and fair funding initiative was kind of dropped in favor of Schools and Communities First, because it was recognized that trying to push those two things at the same time was likely going to result in neither one of them passing. So I think now that the Schools and Communities First effort is behind us, at least in that form, there's going to be advocacy around pushing for full and fair funding, which is a different approach. It would be forcing the state to start increasing education funding to meet like the average in the country per pupil by a certain target date, and there are intermittent target dates there. So I think that's the state effort that's going to be moving forward from here. But when I've done advocacy work in Sacramento, and you meet with legislators, and you talk to them about education, a lot of them will refer back to, well, we're fully funding education, meaning that they brought us back to pre-recession levels, which we know weren't adequate anyway. But there seems to be this like patting themselves on the back for getting to that point, which was never enough to begin with. And it certainly isn't now. And it's certainly, LCFF funding improved things in a certain way, but it also doesn't recognize cost of living in different parts of the state. So, schools in, Modoc County are funded at the same level as schools in LA or Sacramento or the Bay Area. And that's a problem. So, and that hasn't been addressed by LCFF. So I think And the state is facing enormous challenges right now, right? There's lots of calls for our legislators to do different things. And when they feel like they have this marker that they restored us to the funding levels that we had, it's hard to persuade them that they need to spend, because they'll have to make cuts elsewhere, not fund, say, healthcare programs and programs to help the homeless. I mean, it's incredibly difficult. But like I said, I think the next thing will be the full and fair funding effort. And
Trustee
CJ, does that resonate with what you understand?
Yeah, and I've got a few other thoughts that I'll share, but Trustee Crosby has her hand up, and hopefully she'll add to that as well.
Yeah, just briefly, what I would say is that when it gets to fully funding and back to prior 2008 levels, when the downturn happened, we did not have the responsibility of pensions. So that's a whole nother piece that you would have to take out of it in order to really get an idea of what fully funded is according to legislators. And they don't understand that with that additional dollar amount in our pocket, or out of our pocket, as the case may be, that it's a different ballgame.
Thank you. And I think, you know, a few other things is, I mean, one, that the heavy lift is we got to change how they think about it at the state level, because ultimately it is anchored by Prop 98. And Prop 98 in the most brief summary basically says 40% of the state budget is going to go to education, which is a significant amount of money from the state budget, but it's not enough. And I think there's a couple things that I would advocate for at the state level. And one is that they need to put ongoing increases into the base amount of the LCFF, because that is where we kind of see, for lack of a better term, the ongoing increase in revenue. And without that, it's really hard to budget over a 3-year budget cycle some of the things that they do provide for us, because they might be one-time dollars. And that is tough, because we get these one-time dollars, we budget them in the first year, and then we have to take them out the second year. And it makes it a little bit difficult. And I think, as Trustee Jones is suggesting, I have long discussed with some representatives at the state level that concept of, you know, the state provides a funding formula, and for lack of a better term, if it's, let's say, $9,000 per student at the high school level, that's going to be the same for a student who lives in a very high cost of living area versus someone who may live in a much smaller, more rural county where the cost of living is remarkably different. And I think that carries with it many ramifications in terms of not only how do we fund our programs, but how do we support and recruit and retain the staff that provide services to our students. Another area that I don't know that it's popular, but to me, it's something that I've discussed with other superintendents and tried to gain momentum with at the state, but I don't have any, is right now we get funded on an ADA basis, meaning if our enrollment, let's just say for easy conversation, is 35,000 students, and our attendance percentage, our ADA, is 96%, let's say, it's probably closer to 97 in a normal year, then we're only getting funded at that 97% amount. And so that might mean for a district our size that we're not getting funded on, I don't know, Victoria, I'm sure you can help me with the math here, but 11, 12, 13, 1,400 kids. And at, you know, if those students equate to $9,000 a student, you know, that could be very helpful. And so it's one of the things that we think about is, of course, obviously research tells us how important regular and on-time attendance is for students. But if we have a class of 30 students and maybe on average 28 of them are there most days, which is really not the case, but for conversation's sake, you start to understand that we as a school district still have to staff and plan for all 35,000 students. So to fund us on 96% of that doesn't really, you know, doesn't seem like a normal fiscal practice that we would entertain in the private sector. But you know, those are some of my thoughts on the way they can change it. As long as we're under LCFF, I think the biggest thing is changing the base, making sure that that base level funding increases as step one. Any other thoughts from the group or reactions to some of those comments? Trustee Crosby?
I think one of our challenges is that we need to get past the community feeling that they're already overtaxed in comparison with other states. And one of the ways that we can do that is to educate them on where you hear it over and over again, where are those dollars going? And one of the things that is happening is that there are companies that pay nothing in this state because of agreements that they've made with legislators to bring business into this state. And then those items were meant to sunset. And because there's no oversight, that sunsetting isn't happening. So there's legislation that's been put forward to have an independent oversight committee that would watch those type of agreements to make sure that the things that are promised are actually done. Sometimes it's to hire X number of employees from this state, and then that's not even followed through on, and there's no oversight. So we're not necessarily seeing the benefits that were the reason that these agreements are made. So I think understanding that process and then letting the community know that, yes, there are people who aren't paying their fair share, but it's not the schools. We're doing everything we can with the little that we have.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or input from the group on that topic, or ideas for how the model might change at the state level? Okay. As we move to the next topic, I think, one thing that's a challenge I always try and, ask myself the question, if somebody brought me these problems and I had the ability to make a change, how would I do it? And I respect how difficult that process might be at the state level. And there's a lot of competing interests, from early childhood education programs to preschools to community colleges. There's a lot just in the education sector that calls upon the state to make increase allocations in funding. I think the other part, maybe Victoria, that you were mentioning a little bit, which is worth covering, is the idea of mental health. I mean, it's such an important topic, and I'm not sure we can all agree, but yeah, I think it's a fair statement to say that in the last 15 years, our school systems have changed so dramatically in terms of what we're being asked to do to provide a comprehensive system for students. And California is one of the states that does not really incorporate the state mental health program with their school systems, and that other states do that. And I think one thing, if we're looking at those things at the state level, we've kind of gone away from the old categorical funding that we used to receive. But if it's an important metric for the state and an important need for the state, there could be provisions to say to the state, can you provide funding that is categorical in that sense? It's as opposed to the state doing what they often do, which is providing us some sort of underfunded or unfunded mandate. But that's just a thought on that, because I just think that we as a school system, and rightfully so, the students' needs have changed dramatically over the last 2 decades. So it's not that we can ignore our responsibility to be responsiveness to those things, but the funding model in some ways has to keep up with those expectations. So moving on with the agenda, are there other areas of discussion, problem solving, or thinking related to the topic of revenue enhancements locally, at the state level, or anything else that this group might want to discuss and or share?
I thanked you, Superintendent Kamick, and your management team for participating, and the trustees for participating in this, the town halls. But I just want to say again that in addition to this task force, being able to not only go out, share, have that education, and allowing the two-way, I think that you gain, you got as much as you gave. And I think that that's a really important step in this community, and really improving the communication loop that we haven't seen in a while. And it's very appreciated.
Thank you. I was very grateful for the trustees and the staff that participated in that, and the community turnout as well. So thank you. Not hearing anything on revenue enhancements, which is sometimes a more difficult task. Anything to discuss, consider, or brainstorm? And I want to say clearly, I respect that there may not be a lot that's mentioned in this time, because it's a very difficult subject. So I won't take it personally if there's not a lot of discussion, but I do want to put it out there for people in case they do want to discuss it. Are there any ideas or thoughts about how we might make expenditure reductions or adjust our budget allocations as we move into our budget development for next year?
I did have a question, and I think it's in the first interim, but which, I'm not sure how much people have read already, but the CARES Act funding, I think, is noted as an asterisk in the books and supplies, because that budgeted amount is an additional $18 million. But can it be clarified that we're still on track to spend the same amount in books and supplies, but the staff, by the time the second interim comes around, we will have spent all of the CARES Act, and that basically our budget, we're not approving a budget with more books and supplies, I guess would be my question, if you can clarify that.
Rice, you can speak to that, because we actually talked about that today.
Thanks, Marcus. Yes, initially we put all that money in under books and supplies as a placeholder, because at that time we did not have all the details of planned expenditures. But now, as of this morning, we have actually spent $12.1 million that had to be spent by December 30th in different categories. So by the time we present second interim report, the expenditures are going to be reflected in proper categories: salaries, benefits, books and supplies, all the proper areas that it was meant to be spent. So yes, it's going to be very clear by the time we present second interim report.
So then only the remaining 2 million or something that we have until the end of the school year to spend. So that would be the only residual that might still be left in there.
Correct. So out of 16 million, 12.1 had to be spent by December 30th. The remaining amount we are planning on spending by June 30th.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anything else on expenditure reductions?
Well, I guess I'm wondering if that $4 million hasn't been spent yet, but it needs to be, right? Or we would forfeit it. What is the plan for ideas on what we would be doing with that $4 million? Or is that something that this group could provide input on? I know that it's a short-term thing, right? It's only from now until June. But given that we have that money, is that something that this group would be able to provide input or hear about kind of the direction that management is thinking about right now?
Yeah, I mean, this would be a great group to give input on that. Obviously, I think it meets an inherent challenge, Victoria, in the sense that we have a significant budget deficit to start with. But that is money that will be with us through the end of the year, and perhaps maybe Marcus or Rais can comment further on that, and then Trustee Jones also has her hand up. So let me start with Trustee Jones, and then Marcus and Rais, if you can prepare some remarks on that remainder of the CARES Act dollars.
Actually, I had a different question about budget reduction, so maybe it's best to take Marcus and Rais first.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I was going to say, just kind of piggybacking on what CJ was sort of alluding to, I can tell you guys that the team has worked very hard to not grow our budget to the best extent that we can, because we are really cognizant that any increase in expenditures right now is going to require an offsetting reduction. Our necessary reductions are probably going to be impacted. So the CARES Act language does allow us to utilize some flexibilities in our current expenditures and be able to basically do what's called a journal, as long as that expense that we're currently expensing meets the requirements of the CARES Act. So we're trying to take every opportunity we can to do that without creating new expenses, so that we further deplete our reserves and create the need for additional reductions to balance our budget.
Trustee Jones, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, I just wanted to make sure, since I think the last time this group met, we were talking, kind of targeting roughly 11 million in cuts for 21, 22, and then another 16 million the following year. Mm-hmm. And that has changed. And so I want folks to know that what's in the budget, if you pulled up the agenda and looked at the budget item, we're now looking at 17.3 million in cuts or budget adjustments for 21, 22, and an additional 13.3 million the following year. So the overall cut target over the 2-year period has increased, and the balance of the cuts has shifted to the next year. So we were going to be making more cuts earlier, and in terms of how we do it, you know, having gone through this process before and having seen cut lists, this is going to be painful. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is, I know last year we had some restrictions put on us by the legislature that and please understand, I do not want to have to do layoffs of any kind, and I want to find ways to avoid any of that. But we were restricted from making reductions in certain categories of employees, and I want to make sure we understand what we're going to be facing if any of those restrictions are still in place, if anything's been lifted, so we know what's possible and what isn't. Because if there are certain things that are not going to be legally viable, I don't want to waste time thinking about it. I think we have to really focus our energies on things that are possible. So I want to verify what legislatively we may be restricted from doing. But, you know, this is, I mean, it's really painful.
It is, Trustee Jones, and I think you're right. We want to make sure that we understand what the state's parameters are going to be for us, and we may or may not see some changes in that in the January governor's proposal, the budget proposal. We did see some real restrictions implemented at budget adoption this year at the state level. Most of them related to the pandemic, which required that school districts could not, for this school year, reduce transportation, custodial, or child nutrition services staff. And they also made some provisions to adjust some layoff ed code regulations in the beginning of the year for certificated staff. And so we will need to make sure that some of those restrictions are there, or that not that they're there, but that we understand where they are as we move forward. And you're right, this will certainly be a very difficult process. Unfortunately, I've been through this in another district before, where we had to do some really tough work to get the budget back on track. And it is never easy work. And, you know, one thing I would want to say as we move forward with this is, while the number has gone up, we do need to plan for that as our reality. but we also have to know that it's a moment in time as well. It could be that when we see the January's governor, in January, when we see the governor's budget proposal, based on the projections that we see then, what we refer to as the dartboard, which is basically our set of assumptions that we get from the state level, and we give consideration to how conservative or aggressive we want to be in those things, because you'll get a little bit of different numbers between the Department of Finance, the governor's budget, and the legislative analyst's office. It may mean that things look a little bit better. I have my fingers crossed that they do. Revenue projections across the state are, that revenue levels across the state are ahead of projections, which is a good thing. But with the pandemic and the challenges we have across the state, there's likely going to be a large number of things pulling on the state budget this year that aren't traditionally. So we'll have to watch how that affects us at the January mark and the second interim. But I think, Trustee Jones, as you've highlighted, we have to plan for this potential outcome. We can't just kind of sit back and hope that it gets better and then be ready. So we'll definitely have to work on some of those solutions. Victoria, I see your hand.
Yeah, I had two questions. One, the current then snapshot of the 17 million shortfall this year and 13 next year. Does that include the assumption that we will utilize the remaining 4 million in CARES Act to offset? That was my first question. And then secondly, I'm wondering if staff might be able to share for the group, considering that the change now in the projections, if having processed the first interim, you could share for the group some of those pockets in the budget where we actually needed more funds, right? Like we're expending more, which I assume is why we need to cut more, just so that we could have that in kind of our discussion. To see, right, are those the priorities, or should we look at those as areas that we might make adjustments?
So in answer to your first question is yes, that does, those deficits do include all revenue, including CARES Act funding. In regard to your second question, basically what's driving the increase in the deficit for next year, and we did include some of that in the PowerPoint, is we are seeing some savings this year, but those savings would be considered one-time savings. We are seeing some savings in terms of substitutes, and that's certificated and classified substitutes, overtime, contractual services as they relate to special ed services. So many of those services and maybe a few more, we are seeing savings this year, but we have to put those back in the budget for next year, because those savings are a result of our current situation. So we're not really seeing much. So I guess, Victoria, just to answer your question, it's not that increase is not being driven by increased costs, is being driven by the fact that we're seeing savings that we have to put back in the budget next year. They're temporary.
I guess I'm wondering, we previously thought we were going to need to cut 11 million. Now we believe, I thought, which could be incorrect, based on the first interim, the cuts need to be increased to 17 million. So if there isn't increased cost, then I totally get that it's one-time savings this year, which might only push off cuts until the following year. But why would it drive an increased need for cuts next year?
Well, just for example, let's say our budget, and I'll try to keep this in simple terms. Let's say our budget is $1,000 for this year, and we are, and our expenses are 2,000. So we are at a deficit in terms of that 1,000 and the 2,000. So for next year, we needed to make $1,000 in reductions so that we could balance that $2,000 deficit. And this is very sketchy. This is just an example. So let's say for this year, though, we are we are seeing, in addition to that 1,000, we are seeing savings of $500, which going into next year, that savings is not going to continue. So that deficit, that $2,000 deficit has now increased to 2,500, because the 500 savings, even though we had a savings this year, it goes back up again next year because we can't count it again. But when you look at our bottom line numbers, that savings is included in our reserve for this year and for next year. So we are seeing the benefit of it this year, but the benefit goes away next year. So we could probably, I mean, we're going to talk about this in more detail, a little bit more graphically in first interim when we present. But I mean, that's basically what's driving, along with a lot of other factors. But it is the fact that we are not seeing those savings going forward into next year. And just recall, and I just want everybody to realize also, when we presented the $11 million savings, just let's think about what happened at that point. We had completed 45-day revisions. And then in September, we had to do something we normally never have to do. We had to give the county a special, I'll just call it a special budget update for the county. So at that time, the only thing we updated was, with the 45-day revisions, we updated the actions that the board took in August to add back in custodial positions, and we added in the we had finished closing our books, so we adjusted our beginning fund balance. So we did not do a comprehensive financial update like we do at first interim, second interim, and when we adopt our budget. Those are the only 3 times of the year where we do a deep dive comprehensive budget update. The update that we provided in September was only based on the actions the board had taken to date and the change in our beginning fund balance. So I just want to be clear about that. So.
Thanks, Marcus. I thought I saw Joyce's hand up earlier, but then it went down. Joyce, did you have something?
No, I'm gonna take my question offline. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. I want to make sure we get to everything, and if we have more time, we can maybe go back to some things. But the last bullet for our task force member input today was budgeting priorities. And so this all, does realistically fit. I think I just made up a word there by mispronouncing it, but it all realistically fits within the realm of how do we deal with our budget situation. We've talked a little bit about enhancements, a little bit about potential reductions. And so this is really an opportunity to say, if you had to prioritize some things in our expenditures next year, where would your top priorities be? And some context to that, as you all probably know by being invested members of this group, 85 to 88% of almost every school district's budget goes to personnel. And that's very normal across the state. So that doesn't mean that, we can't have a conversation about anything else, but it does mean that most of our dollars are spent trying to serve our students in the best way we can. So as we look at our entire budget, what feedback or input would you have in terms of what should be prioritized at the highest level? Or the lowest level, if you have a input on that.
CJ, that's a tricky thing because some of us here today represent part of that number you just quoted. So if you were to ask an employee union what their priority was, I mean, it would be my employees and their salaries. So I mean, that's an authentic answer. Listen, I've worked with children for over 20 years, so don't get me wrong. I know what business we're in, but as the union representative to almost 700 employees, that's my priority.
Yeah, and I think that's a very fair response, Joyce, and certainly understandable. And I think, if I could, if you'll allow me to kind of maybe expand on that a little bit, it might mean that you would want me to prioritize an analysis of what we're doing in terms of contracts and services first, because you want to prioritize the employees of Fremont Unified School District. So let's look at expenditures that are related to services coming into the district and keep our employees as a high priority. So we would want to look elsewhere where we're spending our money. And I think that that's a very legitimate and understandable response. And if you look around our school district and any other that I've been in, I've never seen a school district that's just overrun with extras, with people who aren't running at Mach 10 trying to do everything they can for students. So certainly, I think a very valid perspective. Trustee Jones?
Yeah, I think when it comes to personnel issues, I think, I think we have to be careful about wording and how we present something, because last year we had taken a position that we were gonna have basically a hiring freeze and when we lost people, we weren't gonna rehire to fill those positions. But then there are positions that are vital, and if somebody leaves them, we have to fill them. So, if a principal leaves, we're obviously not going to leave that unfilled. We're going to have to hire. And I think last year there was an issue where we had somebody in payroll who was going to be leaving. But when we dug into that a little bit deeper, we found that if we didn't fill that position, then people weren't going to get paid. There just weren't enough people left in payroll to get the work done without this position being filled. So I think we have to be cautious if we make a move that says, we have a freeze and we're not going to hire for vacant positions, that we have to have some room to understand that there are certain positions that we would have to refill if they became vacant. And I think that's more of just making sure things are worded properly and presented to the community in the appropriate way.
Trustee Jones, if I can piggyback on that, I appreciate you saying that, because when we did do cuts, we looked at the things that were the least impactful and were vacant, so that we were able to hit that two-prong where the work was still going to get done, our students and employees were served, and then it didn't harm an employee. And so that's always an important, in my take, those seem to be my priorities always. How does it impact the employee? How does it impact the student? And then work from there. But I appreciate you bringing that up.
Thanks, Trustee Jones and Joyce. Marcus, I see your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to say, and I think somebody just mentioned it, we really worked hard with the board last year and with our bargaining units to keep cuts away from staff to the best extent we could. And it was a very deep analysis effort behind the scenes. I will say this, the other thing that I think this group needs to think about, and the board, is the percent of one-time reductions versus ongoing reductions. We did get criticized by the county because we did have quite a few one-time reductions in our reductions. And if we're going to go forward with a recommendation this next month or the following month, if we're going to have a number of one-time reductions, we got to be prepared for the criticism. And we also have to be prepared for the fact that the county may not, it's not that they're not going to approve our budget, but what they may do is make our budget qualified based on the fact of the one-time reductions. So that's just something to think about right now. I'm not, I'm just thinking ahead. That's all, because I kind of understand how the county thinks to a certain extent. It's just something that we need to think about whether we want to go down that road with the county, and that is a board decision, but it is something that they're going to be looking at very closely. So,
Trustee Jones?
Okay, so this is going to be tough, and I'm going to throw this out there as something for us to think about. Knowing the magnitude of the cuts and where we were last year, and that we were cutting positions, I don't know how, I right now anyway, I don't see a way for us not to be touching staff. And I hope that we can find a way for us to avoid that. But if we do need to touch staff, I think we need to, and maybe have private conversations with our bargaining groups to talk about, you know, how that would be handled. Because obviously my position is I would like to avoid layoffs. So if we avoid layoffs, what are our options? There are furloughs. I was in a workshop not too long ago where they were talking about some districts actually freeze the step and column increases for a year in order to realize some savings. So I think there may be options like that. I don't know what all the options are in terms of reducing personnel costs, but I know some of the things, layoffs, furloughs, freezing step and column. I don't know if there are other things, but I would really like to hear from our bargaining units that if we get to a place like that, what are your preferences for realizing those savings? And again, I say this from a position of wanting to avoid that as much as we can.
Thank you, Trustee Jones. And I'm going to assume that maybe our collaboration with our employee groups and bargaining units on those desires could come offline in individual conversations with those groups. Okay. You know, one thing that I think oftentimes comes up, and I'll address it here, and I don't mean to be pessimistic about it, but it certainly comes up in every cycle of budget reductions I've been a part of when we look at some of those personnel costs, Trustee Jones, is oftentimes you hear about an early retirement incentive, and can that save money for a school district? And that's something that each school district has to cost out individually and determine how they might find a path towards savings. And it really includes an analysis of how many people do we separate from each year under natural circumstances through retirements and or resignations. And then we also have to analyze how many additional retirees we would need and what might incentivize those to retire. And one thing that is unique about our current times, and that I've talked with a few districts about, is it's not easy to backfill a number of our positions. So doubling we have to be very calculated in terms of how many vacancies we create, because in a shortage of, just in a certificated sense, in a shortage of teachers, we have to work to fill our vacant teaching positions annually. And if we increase those vacancies by 30 or 40%, that's gonna be a really heavy lift in terms of making sure we get staffed for the next year. But it certainly is worth an analysis and something that each district has to consider. Jenna, I see your hand.
Hi, yes. I've been in the district for 15 years. I was a counselor for 9 years, and this is my 6th year as an administrator. And I'd really like to suggest, I realize that we may have to cut positions, but we can't say that we value mental health and then cut counselors. During the budget crisis in 2008 in this district, I was pink slipped for probably 4 years as a counselor. And I believe it was about 5 years ago, we added elementary school counselors. And I just think now more than ever, we need our counseling team. Next year, when hopefully if we come back to school, we're all have our fingers crossed. I'm anticipating there's going to be a lot of anxiety around kids returning to school, and we really need that counseling support. And then a totally different comment that I have, A couple years ago, Marcus, I believe you presented to the administration management team about things we could cut, things we could add. And there was some sort of property that Fremont Unified owns, I think the horse ranch or something like this. I mean, is that something we've looked at that we could potentially sell, or where are we at with the horse ranch?
Great
Well,
question. Go ahead, Marcus.
yeah, well, currently, the board has authorized the 7-Eleven committee, but that committee was charged with looking at principally one property, which is the Marshall site. The committee would have to get further direction from the board to look at other properties. And as you said, the horse ranch, and I think we have a couple other vacant sites, we will at some point need to discuss with the board, because we are going to, if we don't utilize those properties pretty soon, we are going to have penalties that we would have to pay to the state for unused property, for vacant property. So, so Jane, what I'm saying is that the board is going to have to make some determinations about whether or not they would like the committee to consider further consideration of surplus in some of these other sites. Not.
And there is a one-time exception in the rules this year in terms of surplusing property and the proceeds. And that is that there's a one-time exception that those can be used for general fund expenditures. We'll have to see if that continues in the governor's regulation.
And CJ, that does not expire until, I believe, 2024. So, because they give you time to surplus it plus sell it.
Thank you. And that's going to be an important designation, because in prior years, if we were to sell a property, that money would previously become restricted to only facility enhancements and improvements. So there is some flexibility there. Trustee Crosby, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I think the horse property is a very complicated conversation. One, having property that's big enough for a junior high or high school is always extremely difficult to come by. So this is a very large piece of property. So it's something we would, I think it would be difficult for us to, for me personally, I will say, I would never vote to sell that property because of that situation. It's a huge asset for us. And it's in a location where we have a significant overcrowding. So even with declining enrollment, it's going to be a challenge. That having been said, I absolutely hear you. I think that we have to be looking at the whole child when we're considering any sorts of cuts, and not just not be foolish about where those cuts can come. I think that we need to do everything we can. I like the fact that there is more discussion about parcel tax, and I would want the board to have a conversation about even potentially doing an off-year election, mail election, and find out what the true cost of that would be. Because whereas the parcel tax campaign was unsuccessful last time, I think there's a better understanding of how dire our situation is now. And so that's where I am, but I hear you. I think the mental health concerns are very significant.
Thank you, Trustee Crosby. Mr. Bogle?
Yeah, thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't advocate for the technologies that we've seen be very useful this year. And I think I've talked with teachers, I've talked with administrators, and in technology and education, there's been a paradigm shift, I would say, in the last decade, from looking at technology as more of a nice to have to becoming now what I would say is essential. So sometimes you'll hear it said technology is just a tool, but I think that is still said. But I think this year and last spring has shown that technology is not just a tool; it actually is essential for the success of our students and for the 21st century learning that we want our kids to be doing. So from the perspective of a priority, I would continue advocating for ongoing spending, both on the technology equipment itself, but more importantly, so the support and the training that we need for our students and teachers to be successful.
Thanks, Lucas. Most certainly, a very clear spotlight has been placed on technology in the last 10 months. So very, very important considerations. Anything else from the group in terms of budgeting priorities as we think about moving forward?
I'm wondering, and maybe we'll have a better handle on this by the end of the year. Normally the early primary grades are kind of the time when the children, right, are first seen by certificated educators, and possible learning differences are noted, in addition to all of the mental health and emotion at the junior high, which we hope doesn't, present need for an IEP or something else. But I'm wondering what effect we'll have with this year being distance learning if a smaller number or percentage of students are getting noticed for what those needs are, because it's very challenging right now as a teacher to know that if it is a lack of a resource, lack of a space at home that isn't distracting, versus what that child would look like in an environment at a school site where you can control. If it'll be even more important to maintain those smaller class sizes in those primary grades, so that we get students those services. Whereas if we get everywhere across the board to 30, are we going to see an even slower lag in getting students designated? Having worked in some programs myself, not to the extent of course that Joyce has and others, when students actually get the resources that they need, we see them just blossom, right? So I'm just wondering if that could be something else that we kind of keep on our radar.
Thank you, Victoria. Anybody else? I want to make sure that we give everybody a chance if there is any other interest, but we can also, we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm also happy to kind of look forward to our next meeting and gather input from this group in terms of what you might like to see discussed here. And perhaps Ms. Sandoval, if you could check for me when our next meeting is, I believe in January.
Hi, I believe we are scheduled to meet January 11th.
Okay, thank you. So any specific topics that this group would like to see come forward at our January 11th meeting for discussion or exploration? Trustee Jones, sorry, you moved on my screen and I need a second to see the hand. I got you now.
That's okay. I think, I'm hoping that we can start to have see some concrete ideas start to emerge by then. And I know it's painful to get to that point. But I think we really need to start having some concrete things on the potential list to start talking about. And, as a trustee, I don't want to be put in the position of, say, if our target is 17 million, being given a list that's 19 million to choose from, because that leaves very few choices and means that some of those items are must-dos because of the percentage of the cut that they are. I think asking for a list that's twice as big as the cut target is probably maybe unrealistic and maybe too painful. And I know you've been through this more than I have, but I'm hoping we have a list that's like 150% of the target. I don't know how realistic that is, but as much as we can put on the list, it helps us have choices, and it helps us to identify like those things that we absolutely don't want to touch. And CJ, I don't know what your experience has been with creating a list, but like I said, I don't want to see us have a list that's 19 million when we're trying to make 17 million in cuts. That's not enough.
And just to respond to that, and Trustee Jones, you know, we did do that this year, just to be clear. I mean, we did, I think our total reductions, I don't know, the total list was a big number. And I know we finally whittled it down to 22 million, but I agree with you. I think it's better to have more options and things to choose from.
Yeah.
And go ahead, I'm sorry.
And I think one of the things that happened last year is that our target list looked bigger than it was, but at the very last minute, we had an adjustment that we had to make because of enrollment projections. So then the cut list basically totaled what we had to cut because of the adjustments to our enrollment projections. So I know we had done the right thing trying to set that target, but it came down to like this last minute issue that eliminated a lot of the choices that we had, because we had to reach this target because of missed enrollment projections. So, and I think we're in a better place now. We have a better understanding of our enrollment situation. So I'm not expecting to have a curveball like that thrown at us at the last minute. But yeah, I am hoping that we make sure that we have choices, and that nothing on the list is going to be a forced decision because of the magnitude of what it will get us.
And I just had one more comment, CJ, in terms of priorities, and I think you already talked about that, CJ. But I think it's important for us to understand if there are any sacred cows, because we don't want to move forward with things that nobody will support. So I think, like mental health, I would never put mental health or counselors down. I would not. But that's not to say that they won't make it down. I mean, and I'm just saying, if we're looking at comprehensive, but I'm just saying that I think, and maybe for that next meeting, CJ, maybe it would be help to understand what are the things that we value as sacred, that we would not cut, and maybe we can eliminate those things, and everything else is up for discussion.
Thanks, Marcus. And I think, you know,
even threats of
Trustee Jones, as you were describing, you know, certainly want to bring forward a list that's comprehensive and give some room to maneuver. I would want to say to our group, and we could certainly have some feedback and discussion on this, I might put forward the idea out to our group to say maybe we adjust the date a little bit of that meeting, but I would want a little bit of time to kind of consider that. Or it might mean that we schedule an additional meeting, because Trustee Jones, I think as you're describing, it's going to be important for this group to discuss seeing a concrete list. But I also want us to be very careful, because these are really, really remarkable challenges. And whenever we put together a list that could in any way, shape, or form identify a program or a person, because these meetings are streamed and available, I want to make sure that we kind of get those communications out there so nobody's ever caught off guard, and that to get that legwork done by the 11th, I want to make sure we get it all done. So I'll think about that and try and map out the appropriate timeline and be in communication with our task force to try and help manage expectations around that. But definitely, I think, understand the request for a list to come forward and start to see, you know, in more concrete terms, how do we solve this problem? Trustee Jones and then Joyce.
I think you meant Trustee Crosby, but you don't have your hand up, but I do.
I did, sorry.
That's okay, happens all the time. I think one of the things I will say that was very helpful is that we had not an option of, you know, increase class size or don't increase class size, but it's like, if you do it by one student, if you do it by 2 students, if you do it by 3, these are the different price points, kind of, you know. I think for the board, it was helpful to have options that way, not that it's an all or nothing, but it can be a portion thereof. And I think that even with sacred cows, I think there are things that we definitely went into saying, okay, but I'm unwilling to touch this. And then when we looked at what was left, you may not have any options because we are no longer cutting fat, we are cutting bone. So none of the choices may be good, but we may still have to be coming up with solutions. So I think, you know, having those discussions about, okay, what if we, you know, have a 1 year where we don't have step and calm, those kinds of things that may just push things off while we hope that things improve in the future, I think is worth a discussion. But also I would say, I agree with you 100%, CJ, that some of those discussions when it gets into individual bargaining groups and the timing of this group's discussion versus other groups' discussions has to be very carefully managed, because I think that we don't want to have anyone feel threatened in a way that's untimely and just heightens everyone's concerns.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And it's having been through this before, it's challenging because even if we put a group, a larger group of employees by title on a list, it just is very unnerving in so many circumstances. And unfortunately, this is going to be a practical reality of where we're headed in the next few months. So it's just going to be incumbent upon us to do as much as we can to provide timely communication and clarity. I'm going to go to Joyce, and then I believe it was Rais, and then Victoria. Joyce, go ahead.
Well, I kind of want to piggyback on this. I don't think as much as we want the employees, whether it's a grouping, whether it's a attendance clerk grouping or OA1 grouping, to find out on December 11th that this is a conversation that's happening without them. And I don't want to show up at this meeting on December 11th and start throwing out the ideas, or find out that part of my bargaining unit is on the table in this group. That doesn't mean this group shouldn't be part of it, but I don't think it should start here. I think the work has to be done and then brought here. Like last year, Marcus brought up the work we did prior to the final reductions for CSEA. That was months and months and months of CSEA and the district working to bring a final list. I hate to say working, it's not like I was in agreement, but it was a collaboration that the final product wasn't born at a public meeting, so that my employees found out at a public meeting that their job. So I appreciate that I think it needs to be reversed. I think this meeting has to happen after those conversations happen. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've already forgotten which order I said next. Was it Rais and then Victoria? Yes, thank you. I see you, Sandra. Thank you.
I just looked at the calendar. The governor's budget workshop that we attend is on January 15th. So our next meeting is 11th, but we won't get the information until January 15th. And that, based on that, our number 17.6 million can change, because the revenue projections can change based on that. That plus Davis demographics, they are revising our enrollment projections. That is going to take place towards end of January, I think. I think that's a date we had for them. So that can also change our revenue projections. And as a result, our reserves and ending balances change when those two factors provide us the needed information that we need.
Thank you, Ray. So that may be good consideration to look at our January date as it is, because it most certainly would be helpful to at least have some context to the the governor's January budget proposal. Victoria.
Rice was reading my mind, and I was just going to propose January 25th for that reason. So I don't know if now is a good time. I know we've only got a few minutes left before we head off to the next budget meeting.
How about if we send out a calendar invite and see if most of our team can make that date, for example, or try and find an alternate time closer to the end of January. That might allow for some more of that work that Joyce described to take place as well. And then we can kind of circle back with our budget task force. Does that sound agreeable to the group? Maybe a thumbs up. Okay. Anything else for the good of the order before we finish on time with a minute to go? No? All right. Well, thank you very much for your attendance today on a Monday afternoon. And
CJ, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. For the good of the order, I just want to personally take this opportunity to thank Miss Ann Crosby for serving as one of our trustees. I know I have learned so much from her, and she has always made this district her priority, and I don't expect that that's going to change just because she's not on the school board. So I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you, Miss Crosby.
Thank you, Joyce. That was very sweet of you.
I concur wholeheartedly. And we look forward to honoring Trustee Crosby Wednesday night at the start of our meeting. So perhaps you might be able to tune in and join us, because it is certainly worth celebrating the time and energy committed to Fremont Unified as a school district and a community. So thank you, Joyce, for calling that out. To the rest of you, enjoy your week. If I don't see you, happy holidays. And to the rest of you that I will see, I'll see you in 15 minutes at the next meeting. Take care.